Reviewed briefly measurement, evaluation, and assessment of pupils. Let's turn to program evaluation. What I want to move to now, however, is program evaluation, the different ways that we have of evaluating educational programs to see whether they're working or not. And again, there are really two kinds, where we said there were traditional and alternative for pupil evaluation. In the case of program evaluation, we have scientific models and we have, for the lack of a better term really, humanistic models. And I'm going to just real briefly sort of summarize each of these models. You may recall from your reading much more detailed explanations, but I'm just trying to give you the highlights of what I think you should remember about each of these particular types. First method of program evaluation that I'd like to discuss briefly is measurement-driven instruction. The initials used to designate this in our textbook was MDI. Of course, in California we know of this as high-stakes testing, and you're very well familiar with it. It's based on a very simple idea, really. We simply give objective tests that are standardized. They're commercial instruments, and these tests, of course, are based on the state standards. And the purpose of the evaluation is really just to see whether or not the scores are rising or not. And a good example of how measurement-driven instruction works in evaluating educational programs is the external evaluation that's done for underperforming schools in California. You know, if schools don't meet their API target for a couple of years, then they're designated as underperforming, and an external evaluation team will come in and make specific recommendations based upon that evaluation. Well, that's an example of how we are using a scientific model where we try to measure very precisely units of instruction and then make judgments based upon those measurements. Now, another method of program evaluation that's a little more complex, but it's also under the heading of scientific models, is the context, input, process, product model. This was a method of evaluation that was actually developed outside of education, and we borrowed it from industry about 20 or so years ago. It's been used extensively in evaluating educational programs, for example, that are implemented as a result of grants, federal grants. An example of where we would use this would be maybe evaluating a Title I reading program. It takes its name from the different steps that we follow in implementing the model: context, input, process, and product. The first thing we do when we evaluate using this model is we learn all that we can about the setting where the program is going to be implemented. We look at the needs assessment. We look at all of the demographic characteristics. We realize that the success of this program is going to be determined to a great extent by the environment, the social environment and the physical environment in which the program is being implemented. So we need to learn all about that environment that we can. The second phase is input, and that's where we do a real careful study of all of the resources. We need to make sure that we're putting enough resources into the program and those resources are being directed in the right way if we're going to tell whether the program is working the way it's supposed to or not. Next, we look at the process, the way decisions get made, whether we've got a match between what was supposed to happen and what's actually going on. We look at the communication systems that are supposed to be working among all of the people who are participating in the program. We look at ways in which we get feedback while we implement the program and what sorts of ways we're using that information to make adjustments in the program. All of that comes under the heading of process. And then also we look at the product or the outcomes. That's where we look at the goals of the program, and then we decide whether the objectives and the goals are actually being met. Now notice the model right before this, the measurement-driven instruction model, it pretty much was just this last phase, the product. What the context, input, process, product model does is recognize that a lot more goes into the success of the program than just making objectives and testing those objectives. Now there's another way of evaluating educational programs, and now we're starting to move into sort of the humanistic dimension of program evaluation, and that's program evaluation as connoisseurship. It's been developed by an expert in evaluation who also happens to be a professor at Stanford, Elliot Eisner, and he said that we should approach the evaluation of educational programs kind of the way we would approach the evaluation of a work of fine art. That is, there are certain judgments that we're going to make intuitively, and these intuitive judgments are really based upon qualities rather than quantities or precise measurements. And it also assumes, and this is a real important principle with the connoisseurship model, it assumes that the person who's conducting the evaluation is also an expert in the program that's actually being evaluated. Just like a connoisseur of art is qualified to make critical judgments about a work of art, well, an expert in a certain kind of educational program would have the qualifications to make the same kinds of judgments about those programs. Notice that this model is much more qualitative than quantitative. That is, we're looking at characteristics based upon observations, interviews, feedback, informal as well as formal. An example of where we use the connoisseurship model of program evaluation is with special programs, usually because those special programs have very complex and very sublime goals. For example, ROTC programs. Yes, there's certain content that students are supposed to learn, but also we're trying to assess whether or not students are learning the concept of teamwork. We're assessing whether or not they are acquiring characteristics that we associate with a potential for leadership. Well, we simply can't give a test to find those kinds of pieces of information out. We have to apply the connoisseurship model. There is another approach to program evaluation that is used quite widely, and usually it shows up in the case of evaluations by accrediting agencies. It's called responsive evaluation, and it works like this. It actually combines both qualitative kinds of data that we would have in the connoisseurship model with the quantitative data that we would have in a measurement-driven model. What happens with responsive evaluation is that there is a plan for evaluation that is developed and decided upon by both the evaluating agency, evaluator, and the school. Very specific topics and questions are outlined and agreed upon before the evaluation. And then there is an evaluation that results in preliminary findings or tentative results. And then what happens is that the school simply responds to those tentative findings and elaborates maybe where not enough information was given, or takes issue maybe with some observations that it feels are not accurate. And then the evaluating agency gets back with the school, and there's some give and take, there's some negotiation, there is clarification that goes on, and then the final report is prepared after all of the input is provided from the very many constituent groups that are involved in this evaluation. Notice that it's a process of dialogue, of communication, and it begins with agreement on what it is that both the external agency that's doing the evaluating and the school that's being evaluated, it begins with an agreement on what's important, what is the focus of the evaluation. Now what I'd like to do is to try to consolidate all of these different approaches to program evaluation into one set of events or steps that we would follow. Now first notice that what we're going to do is to identify the stakeholders. What we have to recognize when we're evaluating educational programs in schools is that we have very many different groups of people who have very different expectations of what the educational program will do. That's going to, of course, make it difficult to plan programs and to evaluate programs, but it's just a reality that we have to recognize. And for each group, what we have to do is identify the questions that they're going to ask, the expectations that they have. And that consists really of, once we identify the groups, we simply generate lists of questions that they're likely to want to know the answers to. And then we determine valid sources of information for each of those questions. Now, the next several steps are very logical. We collect the information, we analyze the information, and then we put it into a report form that is going to be intelligible to the different groups that want to know information about the educational program. And, of course, the last step is why we have program evaluation in the first place. We use the information to inform decisions that we're going to make about those educational programs. We adjust the goals. We might change the methods that we're using to implement the program. We might decide to terminate the program. We might decide, because of its success, to even enlarge its scope. Those are all decisions that we make based upon what it is that we found in our evaluation. Remember back to the very beginning of the course when we used a real simple model to describe everything that we needed to know about curriculum. Why, what, and how. Well, we're going to ask a fourth question and insert it into that model. Whether. Whether refers to whether we've actually been faithful to the aims of the educational program. It asks whether we've met the goals and objectives of the program. It asks whether we want to continue the program, or whether there are any changes that we want to make to the program, whether we need to direct more resources into the program, or whether we can make more efficient use of the resources that we have. All of the questions that we structure into the program evaluation model in some way will be addressed in this phase. So there are actually four questions we ask when we look at curriculum: why, what, how, and whether. Now it's time to turn to the various writing assignments for the week. Look at the reading response assignment, and now that you've had this brief review of the content of the reading assignment and have had a chance to read the textbook, you can respond to those questions. Also, there are a couple of discussion activities that we'll continue with. And don't hesitate to give me a call if you have any questions, or send me an email, and I'll drop in and talk to you in our threaded discussions.